These can be extremely positive and formative, and they can be extremely frustrating and destructive based on a whole range of factors. My own experience at Stellenbosch was a very positive one, even though ideologically I was probably far removed from where my professors were. The nature of the journey and the service and the collegiality were really positive for me. So I had a good experience. I know people who have had the most horrific experience of their relationship with their supervisor. And I guess at the end of the day, sometimes we have no control over these things, but ideally, one wants to work under somebody whom you can relate to as a mentor. Not necessarily that you exactly on the same page on all the key things, but that there's a constructive relationship that's mutually beneficial. So a few thoughts about that. Mouton, the research guy from Stellenbosch, Johan Mouton, wrote the book How to Succeed in Your Master's and Doctoral Research. Worthwhile primer to read if you haven't heard of it before. He essentially argues that the role of the supervisor is fourfold, and I've applied my own labels to the things that he gives. But a supervisor is a project advisor. Helping to design, formulate, to a large extent, the direction the thesis takes is a negotiation between the supervisor and the student. Raise your hand if you've discovered this is true. All right? You both got to live with it for a long time, so to some extent it's negotiated until everyone's happy with the direction. That's been my experience, and it's probably been the experience of most people. And what you negotiate obviously depends on the two people. So you're looking for a win-win negotiation, a project that we're all happy with. Sometimes you get an ideal result and sometimes you don't. So Reynard might have had a different experience if he went to Ben with his research proposal. They would have had one negotiation and would have reached a certain agreement as to the direction of the thesis. If he had come to me, we would have had a different negotiation. But at the end of the day, the relationship and the project is negotiated. So the candidate comes and says, I want to do this. The supervisor says, well, have you considered that? Please go and read it. And eventually, hopefully, you find something that is mutually acceptable, if not mutually exciting. Hopefully, it's mutually exciting. And I think most times that's possible. But the supervisor does play a role as a project advisor on the design of the project as a whole. The supervisor is also an academic guide. In an ideal world, the supervisor would be a specialist on the particular topic every student is writing on. That is seldom possible. But the supervisor certainly is an academic guide as to what good academic research in his discipline looks like, how to go about it, etc. And in the same role, another side of the same coin, I think, the supervisor is a quality assurer. So a competent academic supervisor may not know everything about your subject, but he'll certainly know if you're writing a pile of rubbish or if you're making a persuasive argument. He'll know from the kind of presentation whether you engage critically with your sources or you're just regurgitating things that you've read and haven't mastered, etc. So he's a quality assurer. Part of the role of the supervisor is, in a master's and doctoral, not necessarily in an honours level work, but part of the role of the supervisor is to help the candidate to understand, am I more or less on track? And we normally work chapter by chapter. I think that's common. So the candidate writes a chapter, submits it to the supervisor, gets some kind of feedback on that chapter. And part of that feedback has to convey the message, you're on track or you're not on track. And the supervisor has to be able to make that judgment call with a reasonable level of accuracy. So what you don't want is the candidate to get to the end of the journey. We've had this once that stands out in my memory as an institution. Candidate get to the end of the journey. The supervisor all the way through has told him, man, you're doing a great job, this is fantastic. Submits the master's thesis. Supervisor's report comes in, says 85%, and the external says, what is this mess? And the report from the external comes back and says it's worth 35%. And it's incoherent here, and it's not well designed there, etc., etc. So the supervisor must be able to make a reasonable judgment call as to, are we more or less on track, and communicate that through the journey. Now, sometimes one gets to the end of a thesis journey with a student, and you've got to throw your hands up and say, I've done the best I can. I don't know if this is going to pass. And I've been there a couple of times. If I do any more, I'm going to write the thesis. So I can't do more. And I've told the person throughout the journey, this is a concern, that's a concern. They've rewritten each chapter 2 or 3 times. And eventually you've got to say, we're going to submit it as it is, and we think it's borderline. And if the report from the external examiner comes back then and says, this is not a pass, that's okay. That's okay. What's not okay is if I've told you, man, you are the gold star. D.A. Carson, watch out. Right? So quality assurer, giving an indication of, am I on track vis-a-vis the outcomes, criteria, and yardsticks for the level of work that I'm doing. And then the supervisor as a pastoral supporter, as an encourager. We are and should be deeply engaged in the success of the students who work under us. We root for them. I want my students to succeed. I want them to graduate. Partly it's a feather in my cap if they succeed. Obviously it's a stepping stone to their life goals. I mean, we're on the side and should be on the side of those that we take this journey with. Some people are better at the pastoral side of this than others. We've got one guy who is a world-class academic. He is razor sharp. And he has the personal graces of a cactus. And so we've learned over time that we've got to be very careful which students we give to this person. If you give him a sharp student who doesn't need a lot of encouragement and comfort, they do great. So we've learned, we match certain types of candidates to that academic, and it's fine. But most candidates need a bit of encouragement, etc., affirmation. And part of the role of the supervisor, I think, should be to be a supporter, an encourager, an affirmer. It's not just a cold, dry academic game that we play. We're dealing with people's lives, emotions. And most thesis candidates are insecure. Can I do this? Am I on track? And there are moments of the journey when one feels distinctly that way. Okay. Comment there about PhD level in particular, the role of the supervisor. You very seldom at a PhD level can keep up with the candidate on the subject area. So invariably, if you have a half-competent PhD candidate, by a few months into the study, even if you're relatively informed on his study as a supervisor, a few months into the study, he should know more about his topic than the supervisor knows. Be better read, etc., etc. So the dialogue there is often that of a discussion partner, an informed colleague, somebody who's able to ask the right questions, point out gaps in the argument. It's that kind of input that one gives to a PhD candidate for the most part. You shouldn't be having to say to a PhD candidate, yeah, but you've misinterpreted that book, or you haven't read this source. One shouldn't be doing that. It should be at the level of quality assurance, asking probing questions. What about this? Have we considered that? I think you've missed a step in your argument over here. Not at the content input level, because the candidate's invariably beyond the supervisor there. Okay? Role of the student, diligently study all prescribed materials. I say this tongue in cheek because obviously I speak out of a context, and the context is my own institution. And our first step of a master's or a doctoral journey has long been a research course that culminates in a research proposal. And for years, the only thing we asked the candidate to submit was the draft research proposal. So work through the whole course and submit the research proposal. At the end of the course, they get a template, which essentially gives them the headings that are normally part of a research proposal. And what we found in probably close to half of all cases, the first submission that came to us, you could see the candidate had taken the template from the appendix in the study materials and had filled in the template without processing in any meaningful way the prescribed content covering what theological research is. So they'd say, this will be a quantitative, qualitative research project. Okay. It'll be a quantitative study using personal interviews with 5,000 congregants. Okay. Things have gone a bit around. Literally not doing the work to process foundational required materials. So we've now had to go the hand-holding route of adding a whole lot of preliminary assignments, so you can't even get to submit the proposal until you dot all the I's and cross the T's, which punishes the diligent. But it makes our life a bit easier for people who want to rush straight through and treat it as a template. So part of the role of a student is to diligently study all prescribed materials, to carefully apply the supervisor's advice. Now, that doesn't mean supervisors speak ex cathedra. George Whitfield's not Roman Catholic. No, okay. Supervisors don't speak ex cathedra. And of course, advice is up for negotiation. So one can go back to a supervisor and say, you suggested this, can we talk about it? But for the most part, to be responsive and teachable to input. To initiate contact and request meetings is normally the role of the student. We had a guy recently contacted us absolutely irate that his supervisor hadn't contacted him for 1.5 years. He actually was wrong. He had overlooked or intentionally overlooked an occasional email. But for the most part, it's a two-sided coin. It was his job to contact the supervisor and initiate contact and say, can we talk about this, or I've been reading that. So for the most part, the initiating of contact is driven by the agenda of the student, for the most part. What I do with all my thesis candidates is I take the due dates on their research proposal. We make them submit intended due dates, chapter 1 by this date, chapter 2 by that date, and I put them on my Outlook calendar with a 2-week in advance reminder, and when the reminder pops up, I send an email and just remind them that there's a chapter due. But for the most part, that's not really my job. It should be his job to be working. To abide by the approved research proposal. Now, the approved research proposal is not cast in stone. Research is a dynamic undertaking. And as we work and we read, and things always move. We have a colleague on our postgrad committee whose hobby horse is thesis titles. So every proposal he reads, he comments on the title. Suggests the title change to this. The proposed title is this, but I think the title should be, and he'll give a more refined version of the title. My own take on it is I don't give 2 feathers what the title is on the research proposal, because you can write in stone that it will be moved with some nuance by the end of the thesis. So I'm actually quite happy to write the title at the end. But the reality is that there's an approved research proposal, normally. I assume that's the case. And that research proposal is an agreement. Now, this is more or less where I'm going. And I think if you as a candidate are going to deviate substantially, I wanted to go there, but now I realize that's a waste of time. Now I'm going to head off in this direction. If there's a meaningful deviation from the agreed research proposal, that's got to be renegotiated. And that's fine, it can be, it's not written in stone. But unless there's that kind of renegotiation, it's the student's job to stick to what's agreed for the direction of the study. And then, of course, to work diligently and steadily. This is Mouton again. He suggests a number of research ethics. Rule 1, dignity, respect, and courtesy. No harassment. So it's not appropriate to phone your supervisor at 12:30 midnight on Saturday. That kind of thing is what he means by that, or to phone incessantly, etc. All right, so some suggestions for secrets of success from me. Negotiate the terms of your working arrangement for a master's or doctoral thesis. What can I expect from my supervisor? What can my supervisor expect from me? And it's appropriate to discuss that. When I say negotiate, I mean discuss that, be transparent, because often the irritations and frustrations come from a conflict of expectations. Initiate interaction, follow the supervisor's advice. Don'ts are sometimes easier to pinpoint than others. Don't rush ahead without your supervisor's permission. We're dealing with a case at the moment. I'll come to you. Let me comment on what I mean by this. Don't rush ahead without your supervisor's permission. We've got a student, a master's candidate, had an approved research proposal. The research includes surveys or interviews or some kind of field research. He needed to develop a questionnaire and then obviously go and administer this questionnaire, as is the custom in that kind of field research. And what he's done is he's written the questionnaire and he's gone and done all the surveys with the people who were willing to participate in it, and none of the data is usable. Why? Because he messed up the design of the questionnaire. Why? He never discussed it with his supervisor. He just rushed out and went and did something. You only get one bite at the cherry with that kind of thing. He actually can't fix it. So now we sit with this headache, and we've got a guy that's just effectively shipwrecked his own journey because he just rushed out and went ahead and did it. And that kind of thing's relatively common with field research. That people rush out and do something without the discussion. Tell me your name. Vuyani.
What happened to a situation where your supervisor does not respond to emails and is silent for 2 months? Do you kind of wait for them to come back before you continue, or do you just continue to write? Because
if it was SATs, we would want you to tell our postgrad school that I've waited this long and I've had no response to communications. Now, if it's another institution, I can't speak. But we would then obviously contact the supervisor and say, what's going on? Sometimes there are breakdowns in communication, but if it was our institution, we'd want to know about them. We'd want to try and see if there's some way forward. One gets various challenges with postgrad candidates, and candidates have challenges with supervisors. I mean, you get candidates who will send you a 100-page chapter today, and tomorrow they want to know, any feedback. Or
tell them you've received it.
at least I acknowledge it. Thanks, I received.
Yes, I would always acknowledge. I would always send an email saying, thank you, got your chapter. I'll try and get back to you in 2 weeks. Another one is, and we've had this quite a few times, a guy sends in a 70-page chapter, supervisor sends feedback which effectively says, it's not up to standard, please go and read, and he gives him a reading list. 12 volumes of Bart. This is Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah.
Thursday morning is the revised version. chapter 3, draft 2 in your inbox. So that's another version of that kind of frustration. It's a challenge. I think it's important to discuss at the outset what are the terms of our working relationship. And to some extent, it's best initiated by the supervisor, because as a student, you're a little bit disempowered to initiate that kind of discussion. Although the universities, when they talk about best praxis, will tell you that there should be contracts and agreements and all of those kinds of things between a supervisor and candidate. I don't know if that's just a nice theory or if it's actually happening anywhere.
Why the student can't initiate the working relationship with the supervisor?
I don't say can't, but often one feels it's because of the power disequilibrium. Often students don't feel at liberty to initiate the discussion. What can I expect? If you're comfortable doing it, do it. Yeah, by all means. And it's not an unreasonable thing. You know, how long will it take? All things being equal, how long will it take for you to return a chapter submission with some feedback? And that's a reasonable question. I tell my students, I'll normally return a chapter in 2 weeks, and if I can't, I'll tell you why. I'm out of the country, I'm attending this or that event. Unfortunately, your chapter arrived the day after somebody else's entire thesis, so it's going to take longer. But at least you manage expectations. And most people are happy with that, by the way, you know. If it's the exception, not the rule. Most people understand that that's just the way life is. So don't expect your supervisor to spoon feed you. And don't treat your supervisor like a half-wit. That's my Pentecostal counsel. I had a master's candidate who wrote, he went on and on and on, the master's thesis in New Testament. You know, he was telling me there are 27 books in the New Testament, thank you. 4 of them are Gospels, thank you. Some were letters that Paul wrote, okay, that's helpful. And I had like 9 pages of rubbish. Absolutely, and it had nothing to do with the thesis. It was just introduction to his work on the New Testament. You write a thesis at the end of the day, not because the whole world wants to read your introduction to the New Testament. You write it to demonstrate that you belong in a community of scholarship and to grow into that community. And the person that reads your thesis in New Testament almost definitely knows there are 27 books in the New Testament. And I actually think he even told me that there were 2 testaments.
So do you assume that the supervisor knows what you're talking about?
Yes, you definitely.
With stuff that's really obvious, yes. And especially with stuff that doesn't build anything into where you're going with your own process. So this was just padding. He had a good number of pages that you would expect to find. You know, it's what he would have told his Sunday school class on introduction to the New Testament, and it wasn't contributing anything to the argument. So bear in mind that your supervisor is at least a half-competent reader.
Sometimes it's also difficult to tell. I got a comment that your chapter assumes too much knowledge on the reader's part. So that was a little bit difficult to deal with, because how do I measure? How do I know? And I guess the reader is the supervisor, or probably thinking about the examiner. So it's a little bit difficult there.
Yeah, I'd grant you, it's a judgment call. But there are certain things you probably can clearly not have to say. But it is a judgment call. But be wary of stating stuff that's so self-evident that it's almost insulting.
I think you've said it all. But what I wanted to add, that does it then mean you will need to substantiate, it will be safer to substantiate if you think this may sound too simple or too obvious, but you've got a purpose. If there is a purpose, maybe it will be safer to substantiate.
Well, again, a competent reader will see the relevance, if it's truly there, of the information you're providing. And if you're providing a whole lot of superfluous information that's not material to the argument, a competent reader will be able to say, what's this for? Yeah. I'll leave it there. Obviously, it's a judgment call. All right. Suggested covenant. I'll give you one. If you want to take it to your supervisor, you can try. Right. Suggested covenant. Supervisor's responsibilities. Provide guidance about the nature of the research, requirements of the degree, standards expected, choice of research topic, acquisition of research skills, etc. So, supervisor helps you to develop research skills. I'll guide you in the preparation of a research proposal that complies with the requirements of whatever the institution is. I'll give you this whole slideshow, so I don't need to go through all of this. I think it's helpful for a supervisor to keep a written record of all correspondence, meetings, etc., some sense of where it's gone. Supervisor, I'll hold you accountable for completion dates in your research proposal and request periodic progress reports. There's a certain psychology to this. We work on a study at your own pace basis for master's and doctoral research candidates. So for the most part, the candidate has to drive that. But there must be some responsibility to try to keep to the dates that are agreed in the research proposal. And I think a supervisor should try to hold the candidates as much as possible to those dates. Obviously, if something makes it impossible, one can renegotiate the dates. They're not written in stone. But they should have some significance. I'll respond to requests for comments in a timely manner. My personal policy is I try and answer email queries in 2 days, not more. And I try, and I often don't manage, but I try to respond to chapter submissions in 2 weeks. And will generally tell my student, I'm not going to be able to respond because, but I'll try and get it back to you by such and such a date if I'm not going to make the 2 weeks. And so at least there's some responsibility on both sides. To make myself available for periodic meetings on request, these can be on Skype in our context or some other technology. Face-to-face is preferable, of course. Monitor carefully your performance relative to the standard required for the degree. And this is a really important role of the supervisor, in my opinion. Now, I know nobody's listening to me because you're all reading the cartoon. To ensure that you are made aware promptly of inadequate progress or standards of work by specifying the problems and discussing ways of addressing them. When I first started supervising thesis candidates, my natural tendency was to do too much. I used to give feedback to the point that I should have got a quarter of a thesis certificate on my wall for some of them. And so over time I've learned to do less, and specifically to do less as the thesis goes further. So I'll give copious feedback at the beginning and minimal feedback at the end, because by the end you should be functioning as somebody who's met the outcomes of a master's or doctoral degree. And so I scale the feedback that I give. I also limit the number of resubmissions. I have a friend who resubmitted his doctoral thesis to his supervisor 9 times. I sent it in, got it back with comments, made corrections, sent it in 9 times. The key outcome for a PhD is that the person must demonstrate capacity as an independent researcher. If you've got to be told 9 times how to fix this mess, you don't deserve a PhD. Right? So there got to be some limits on that. some limits that force the student to submit something that's genuinely their own work, even though there's been input and counsel along the way. So I now work on 3 submissions. The first time somebody submits something, I'll give it back with comments. When they submit it again, I'll read it, and at most I'll give it back again with comments. And the attachment that says, whatever you return now, I take as final. We've had students, many of them in fact, that on page 1 of a submission, you'll correct a certain error. Right? And I'll correct 5 of them. And then I'll put a note in the margin that says, you've consistently got this wrong. I will stop correcting it, but please make sure that you sort it out throughout your work. You know what you get back? Draft 2 with 5 instances corrected, and everything else the same. They've got to take responsibility for their own submission at the end of the day.
Yes.
Supervisor's responsibilities: I shall assist you in the development of research and writing skills, but not serve as your editor. It's not the responsibility of the supervisor to edit your work. It is, I think, the responsibility of the supervisor to help you become a capable academic writer. Now, what's the difference? Well, our role is to teach what is good and what is not good writing. And one can do that by pointing out examples of places you could improve here by doing that. Be wary of this. This is a generalization, unsubstantiated claim, etc., etc., and an occasional example of how to improve things. The difference is, an editor's job is to correct every instance of an error, to ensure that the final product has all the particular instances of a mistake ironed out. The role of a teacher is to say, this is this kind of mistake, here's how you can correct it. And to do that a few times, after which it's the role of the candidate to have learned and to correct the rest of his work.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So do you get it edited after feedback or before feedback? Especially
Depends how bad your initial draft is written.
How do you know how bad it is? You're sending it because you don't know it's bad. You think it's great.
We work on language issues particularly, right? I mean, we've worked with quite a few Ethiopian candidates living in Ethiopia, and I hope I say this without prejudice, because Ethiopia as a country has a very poor second language English level, generally. And some of the people that I've worked with have submitted their drafts to a professor who teaches English at a university in Addis. And what's come back, I would have considered inadequate for a secondary school literacy level in English. And so sometimes that kind of thing is a real challenge. How you would know, hopefully, is that your supervisor would tell you, this is very poorly written, please ensure that you get it properly edited before you send it to me. Hopefully. Now my take would be, in a draft submission, if your language usage is reasonable, I would accept it and comment on content and make a few grammatical suggestions. And with the instruction, you'll need to have the final thesis edited. But sometimes somebody's English writing skills, assuming it's written in English, just in context, sometimes somebody's English writing skills are not even good enough for that, and you need to have somebody help you that even the draft submissions are coherent. Otherwise, you're prejudiced, because like it or not, the incoherence of the way you express yourself impacts the way the supervisor reads your work. He may say it doesn't, it does. John, you wanted to comment?
No, in the final draft, if you're not, the mistake I've made is editing and in great detail. Okay. But now, if one drops that, in our context here, a lot of students will submit very poor English as a final draft. Then can you pass them if their English is terrible?
In a thesis, I would suggest no. We have a language policy as an institution which says we do not prejudice somebody for having imperfect English skills if they're a second or third language speaker, which the majority of our students are. And I think you can apply that for a certificate student. And on a sliding scale as you go up the levels. But for a master's or doctoral candidate, I don't think you can write something in very poor grammar and English expression and submit it as a dissertation. Therefore, it's the obligation of the candidate to submit it to a competent language editor, and it's at your expense.
And would that apply to VTH, the mini dissertation as well?
That's institution policy, I think.
Yeah.
You'd have to decide as an institution. We should, and I do think it's part of my role to try and help people improve their writing skills and their command of English grammar. Some supervisors can't do that. I'm a first language English speaker with a reasonably good command of grammar. So that's within the scope of something I can help with. But some of our supervisors are not first language English speakers. So their ability to help with grammatical things would be less, they'd be less able. Not because they're not competent in their field of expertise, but because they're not competent English editors. And they shouldn't have to be. You happy with that as a treatment? Okay?
For the sake of progress, so that the targets are met, is it? I have made an understanding with my supervisor. My English is horrible, but if you are able to read what I'm writing, then I'm noting a correction, so that at the end, I'm not bogged up with making corrections, so that at the end of the day, I can't reach the destination. But then I note the corrections, then the final draft should be perfected. Is it not possible to make?
If your supervisor is happy with that, and that's an agreement that you've reached, then it's fine. Yeah.
But I think sometimes also what I seem to see lacking is students who fail to realize their own inefficiencies, their own incapabilities language-wise, and then the assumption is, okay, I'll just submit it at the end of the day, and then it becomes horrible. But perhaps someone being made aware of that, at least the work is going, and then the final draft has to be perfected.
I agree with you, and I think a supervisor may be happy to work like that, but I would make a proviso. It impacts the way your work is read if the language usage is very poor. No matter how much somebody may try to say, I'm looking beyond that, it's almost impossible to completely look beyond that. So, if that's the case, be wary that you're not being prejudiced.
And the external examiner may just kick it out.
Well,
but it hasn't gone to
he's assuming it's going to be edited before going to
edited.
Yeah.
Then the final draft is given to a language editor who will do the professional editing.
Yeah. That's totally legitimate.
When it's acknowledged.
Sure.
Yes.
Sure. Okay, and providing academic feedback on your thesis chapters on a sliding scale. Now this for me is a key way of working. A lot of feedback in the early stages, very little towards the end. Because by the end, you should be working at the requisite level. The early stages, you're learning to get there. By the end, you should be there. All right. Students' responsibilities, we'll rush through these in a hurry because we're about out of time for today. I think these are the students' responsibilities. Heed my academic advice and diligently make all the required changes or corrections. Can I negotiate if I disagree with a comment my supervisor makes? Absolutely. But otherwise, to be responsive. You must discuss with me your expectations concerning the kind of guidance and feedback you wish to receive. People have different expectations. I'm currently working with a doctoral candidate who likes almost no feedback. He takes me to breakfast once every 6 months. Hey? Talk about ultra marathon running, which is his great passion, for half an hour. And all he wants is the high level thing, direction, framework. That's all he wants, and that's fine. Other people want nitty-gritties, Try to be able to say, it would really help me if you could give me this help or that help or whatever the case might be. Okay, commit to work steadily on your research and to inform me if for some reason you're unable to do so for an extended period of time. This is common courtesy. To tell the person who's working with you, I've had a crisis, I've been hospitalized for 3 months, I'm going to be unable to work on my thesis for another 3 months, can we move our deadlines back? That kind of communication is common courtesy, and I think you should extend it to your supervisor. You must keep to the chapter submission dates proposed. You must share and discuss with me any major change to your proposed study. So, proposal is an agreement. If you suddenly see it's heading in a different direction, let's be transparent about that. It's totally negotiable. Just don't submit a thesis that looks nothing like what I was expecting. That's not acceptable. You must not undertake any field research without my explicit approval to proceed with it. So if your research involves field research, interviews, questionnaires, any empirical data collection, every step of that journey is negotiated, approved. A pilot study is conducted, and then only at the end of that can you go out and collect the actual data for the thesis. And that, if you're going to do research that has this empirical component, take it very slowly and do nothing without getting explicit approval, step by step. Do not rush out and do a whole bunch of surveys. You must submit 1 chapter of your thesis at a time. I've learned the hard way. Some people submit 4 chapters at a time. What's wrong with that? Well, if the first one is a mess, guess what? All 4 are a mess. So when you submit 4 chapters at a time, you put me under the terrible pressure of having to read 4 collections of rubbish, which I don't want to do. I haven't got the time to sift through 200 pages of nonsense that we could have fixed if you had submitted 40 pages of nonsense and we'd had a chance to work through it. So my time's too valuable to me, if not to you, to waste it sifting through all of that. And secondly, you've just blown however long it took you to write the last 3, because I'm not going to comment on them. I'm going to comment on the first chapter, and when you submit that to my satisfaction, I'll let you submit the next one. So if you send me 4 chapters, I'll send 3 back and I'll comment on 1. 1 chapter at a time. Now, maybe your supervisors don't work like that. I don't think there's another sensible way to work other than incrementally with an opportunity to make sure that we're on course. And lastly, you must take responsibility for editing your work properly before submitting it to me for feedback. The draft submissions, I'll accept your in-house editing. The final one, you may need to have formally or professionally edited unless your own English skills are satisfactory. Okay, a lot in there, but it does help to have some kind of pre-understanding of how are we going to work together. What's my role? What's your role? What are we all happy with? And my experience is if you don't do that up front, you'll never do it, and you'll have all the conflicts of expectations that are likely to ensue. Tomorrow morning we'll start on the nitty-gritties of a research proposal, which I think is the make or break component of theological research, and probably spend a couple of hours on the research proposal early tomorrow morning.